Do you know why your inner strength feels borrowed during pressure? You think your mind reacts freely, yet invisible forces shape your focus. If you want to resist silent influence, then watch the unseen patterns carefully. Resilience looks simple, but its roots hide inside mental structures that most people never observe. The stronger mind is not only brave, but also trained to see invisible psychological force. Dark psychology maps these forces like a manual of quiet pressure that runs beneath common behavior. You never notice this, but your reactions often follow a pattern shaped by repeated exposure to influence. Manipulators understand these mental shortcuts long before you learn to guard them. They use them because people forget that the mind saves energy through predictable habits. The first strategy strengthens resilience by building awareness of influence loops. Influence loops are mental cycles where a repeated message becomes an emotional reflex. You respond without checking truth. Your mind tries to reduce effort by trusting repetition. This is where manipulation begins. The moment the mind accepts repetition as truth, then pressure becomes normal. Awareness breaks this loop by forcing your mind to pause before reacting. You learn to question why a certain feeling rises. Machiavelli once said, "If you shape perception, you never need to control action." This is the core of every influence loop. Once the loop is exposed, then its power loses grip. The second strategy strengthens resilience through emotional distancing. Emotional distancing does not mean removing emotions. It means creating a small space between impulse and reaction. That space is where clarity lives. When pressure rises, people collapse because the emotion becomes the decision. Emotional distancing lets you hold the emotion without obeying it. This technique stops emotional draining because draining works only when reaction is instant. You never notice this, but many silent manipulators test how quickly you react. They want speed more than accuracy because speed gives them control. Slowing the emotional reaction returns the control to you. Albert Bandura once said, "If you master your emotional state, you master half the world." This mastery becomes a shield against quiet pressure. The third strategy strengthens resilience through cognitive reframing. Cognitive reframing means changing the meaning you give to pressure. Pressure feels heavy when it is seen as threat, but becomes lighter when seen as signal. Manipulators push threat interpretation so you feel cornered. When the mind enters a corner, it loses creative thinking. Fear blocks options. Reframing breaks this trap by expanding the meaning of discomfort. Discomfort becomes information, not intimidation. When you treat discomfort as message, then it stops controlling you. Your resilience grows because pressure becomes a map, not a cage. You never notice this, but reframing changes your entire internal environment faster than any external change. The fourth strategy strengthens resilience through controlled focus. Attention is the most stolen resource in dark psychology. Influence works only when your focus becomes narrow and reactive. You think you decide what to focus on, but your attention often follows emotional spikes. Controlled focus means choosing your mental target before pressure pushes you. Pressure loses power when you maintain stable focus. Manipulators depend on distraction because distraction weakens logical processing. When attention scatters, your mind becomes easier to steer. You protect your mind by practicing steady focus on facts, not feelings. This creates a psychological barrier that stops emotional draining from entering your decision process. Controlled focus is like drawing a clear circle where only chosen thoughts operate. The fifth strategy strengthens resilience through pattern recognition. Every manipulative technique follows patterns. These patterns include sudden urgency, false guilt, emotional overload, strategic silence, or repeated disappointment. When you recognize these patterns, your mind stops falling into automatic compliance. Pattern recognition removes the element of surprise, and without surprise, pressure collapses. You never notice this, but half of manipulation depends on surprise. If you can predict the move, then the move dies before reaching you. Pattern recognition trains your mind to see the intention behind behavior, not just the behavior itself. Once intention becomes visible, pressure becomes ordinary, and ordinary things cannot break mental strength. These 5 strategies work together like a psychological shield that grows each time you apply them. Awareness reveals loops. Emotional distancing creates clarity. Reframing shifts meaning. Controlled focus protects attention. Pattern recognition exposes hidden intention. When these 5 merge, resilience becomes automatic. The mind learns to maintain stability even when emotional waves try to break structure. You start noticing how influence attempts rise slowly. You see how pressure enters through uncertainty. Manipulators rely on your confusion, but confusion weakens when structure becomes strong inside you. Every strategy creates internal structure that blocks emotional draining. This manual type awareness teaches that resilience is not a talent. It is a decision supported by practice. You strengthen it by repeatedly observing your mind when pressure grows. Your goal is not to fight pressure, but to understand the path it uses to reach you. Once the path is visible, then you can close it. Most people fail because they defend the wrong area. They defend feelings instead of defending attention. They defend pride instead of defending clarity. They defend reaction instead of defending reflection. Dark psychology shows that pressure wins because people defend the wrong way. Your mind becomes resilient when you defend the right thing at the right time. The hidden truth is that psychological pressure does not break you. It only activates weaknesses already inside. These weaknesses form through old habits, emotional wounds, trusted illusions, and repeated compliance. When you examine these areas, the weakness loses influence. Manipulation becomes harder because your mind no longer provides easy entry points. Once the entry points collapse, every mental attack loses direction. You never notice this, but most emotional draining works by targeting the same weakness repeatedly. Remove the weakness and the attack ends. Keep observing how your emotional energy drops during certain interactions. The drop reveals where influence enters. When you notice the entry, you can reinforce that area. Never ignore the early signs because the earliest signs are the purest signals. Late signs carry emotional noise. Early signs show intention clearly. Resilience grows when you pay attention to these signals without denying them. Denial gives manipulators room to grow. Awareness closes that room. The most powerful minds stay steady because they build internal permission systems. These systems decide what enters the mind and what gets rejected. Pressure becomes weak when it does not get permission to stay. You train this system through repetition. The more you practice choosing thoughts, the stronger the system becomes. Every choice strengthens the mental walls. After some time, influence attempts bounce away without effort. The mind stops fighting and starts filtering. Secret manuals of dark psychology always repeat one warning. Influence wins quietly, not loudly. It enters through subtle pressure, not dramatic attacks. You resist it by mastering subtle awareness. This is the hidden core of resilience. Strength grows silently the same way pressure tries to enter silently. Silence against silence creates balance. But there is still one hidden layer behind these 5 strategies. A layer that decides whether your mind stays free or becomes controlled without noticing. What happens when this hidden layer activates without your permission? You feel strong yet invisible tension shapes your reactions before choice appears. You think your thoughts protect you, but unseen pressure moves faster than logic. If you want deeper resilience, then learn how subtle influence rewires inner rules. The hidden layer behind resilience is the mental blueprint that controls your interpretation of the world. You never notice this, but every pressure you feel enters through interpretation, not through events. Interpretation creates meaning, and meaning creates emotion. Manipulators know this truth and shape meaning before you even think about it. When meaning bends, your mind follows automatically. This blueprint decides your response long before you see the moment as pressure. The silent mechanism behind this blueprint is something called internal conditioning. Internal conditioning forms when repeated messages slip inside your mind without resistance. These messages set rules that tell you what to fear, what to accept, and what to doubt. When these rules operate, you assume they are natural. They are not natural. They are internal codes formed by influence. Machiavelli once said, "If you control the internal codes, you never need force." Pressure becomes a suggestion that feels like your own thought. Resilience becomes weak because the mind mistakes conditioned thought for free thought. The first element of this hidden layer is mental priming. Mental priming is the act of preparing your emotional response before the situation begins. You think you react to the moment, but the reaction was rehearsed by earlier influence. Repeated tone, repeated emotion, repeated tension all prime your mind to respond in predictable ways. The manipulator does not need to push hard because your mind is already leaning in the desired direction. Priming weakens resilience because it steals neutrality. Neutrality is the space where clarity lives. Resilience collapses when neutrality disappears. The second element is cognitive imprinting. Cognitive imprinting happens when old emotional experiences shape how new pressure feels. The mind stores emotional signatures and matches them whenever similar tension appears. This match makes your reaction stronger than needed. You never notice this, but many emotional drains work by triggering an old imprint. You feel heavy because the weight belongs to the past, not the present. When imprinting controls reaction, resilience turns reactive. The mind stops filtering and starts reliving. Albert Bandura once said, if you let old emotion guide new action, you surrender control. Resilience begins when you stop surrendering to old imprints. The third element is compliance conditioning. Compliance conditioning teaches you to reduce conflict by giving easy agreement. You do not agree because you believe. You agree because the mind learned that agreement removes discomfort. Manipulators rely on this because conditioned compliance is faster than logic. They do not need to convince you. They only need to increase discomfort slightly. The conditioned part of your mind acts first. Agreement becomes automatic. Resilience weakens because the mind avoids pressure instead of analyzing it. Automatic compliance is the doorway through which silent control enters. The fourth element is emotional bypassing. Emotional bypassing is the act of skipping logical analysis because emotions feel urgent. When emotion rises sharply, the mind believes it must act immediately. This urgency is a false alarm. Manipulators use urgency because urgency blocks your resilience. The mind becomes narrow and rushes to action. The moment you rush, you lose perspective. Pressure appears stronger than it is. Emotional bypassing turns small signals into heavy commands. Resilience fails because clarity does not get enough time to operate. The fifth element is subtle reward reinforcement. Reward reinforcement means your mind remembers every moment when giving in felt easier. These moments create mini rewards. The manipulator uses this by giving small relief after your compliance. Your mind associates surrender with comfort. The comfort becomes reward, and the reward becomes a habit. Resilience then decays quietly. You feel safe when you comply and uneasy when you resist. This is the perfect environment for psychological pressure. Your own mind supports the influence without realizing the cost. These 5 elements form the hidden layer that decides how strong or weak your resilience feels. Awareness of these elements breaks the invisible influence. When you recognize priming, you regain neutrality. When you recognize imprinting, you separate past from present. When you recognize compliance conditioning, you break the cycle of surrender. When you recognize bypassing, you slow the urgency. When you recognize reward reinforcement, you stop the comfort trap. Your resilience rises not because pressure decreases, but because interpretation changes. Now the deeper reveal begins. Resilience is not only protection from pressure. Resilience is also the resistance to internal distortion. Distortion appears when your mind misreads intention. Your mind starts creating meaning that supports the influence. This distortion grows when your internal blueprint is weak. Pressure enters through the blueprint and creates illusions. Illusions appear as fears, assumptions, suspicions, or guilt. Each illusion steals a small piece of your mental strength. The more illusions you accept, the weaker you become. You never notice this, but pressure rarely attacks directly. It attacks by feeding illusions that reshape your inner map. Every illusion has 3 stages. The first stage is subtle tension. Subtle tension feels like something is wrong, but you cannot identify why. The mind becomes alert without direction. This is the perfect time for influence. The second stage is emotional tilt. Emotional tilt is when the mind leans slightly toward fear or guilt. This tilt makes logical analysis harder. The third stage is false certainty. False certainty is when the mind creates a conclusion even when evidence is weak. This conclusion supports the illusion, and the illusion supports the pressure. You break illusions by increasing internal clarity. Clarity is the mental state where you see the difference between internal signals and external pressure. Clarity grows through targeted reflection. Reflection means examining not the situation but your reaction to it. Ask yourself why your reaction formed. Ask yourself which internal rule activated. Ask yourself which old imprint got triggered. This kind of reflection pulls you out of influence. Reflection makes the internal blueprint visible. Manipulators hate clarity because clarity destroys illusions. Resilience thrives when clarity stays active. There is a deeper mechanism inside this blueprint called mental boundaries. Mental boundaries are invisible lines that decide what enters your emotional space. When boundaries are weak, pressure enters easily. When boundaries are strong, pressure cannot cross. Boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are filters. A wall blocks everything. A filter selects what matters. Resilience depends on the filter, not the wall. When your filter knows what to accept and what to reject, your mind stays stable. Emotional draining becomes impossible because draining requires free access. To strengthen boundaries, you must master 3 movements of thought. The first movement is detection. Detection means sensing when pressure enters through priming or imprinting. The second movement is questioning. Questioning means challenging the message before accepting its meaning. The third movement is redirection. Redirection means choosing a different interpretation that protects clarity. Each movement strengthens your boundary and weakens external influence. Resilience becomes automatic once these movements become familiar. Now comes the part people ignore. Resilience is not only mental. Resilience is also energetic. Your emotional energy drops when influence becomes heavy. When energy drops, your cognitive control weakens. Your mind becomes tired and accepts pressure faster. Manipulators know this and drain your energy through confusion, tension, or guilt. When your energy drops, your resilience becomes fragile. The mind opens doors it normally keeps closed. The secret manual warns that energy always affects psychological strength. You protect energy by reducing unnecessary internal conflicts. Conflict wastes strength. Clarity preserves strength. Stability grows when conflict decreases. You must also understand the silent role of expectation. Expectation creates emotional vulnerability. When an expectation fails, the mind becomes open to influence. Disappointment lowers resilience. The manipulator uses this moment because your logic takes longer to activate. If you control expectations, you control vulnerability. Expectations must remain realistic and neutral. Neutral expectations reduce emotional shock. Reduced shock increases resilience. The mind stays balanced even when things shift suddenly. Once these deeper mechanisms combine, your resilience transforms into a structured force. This force is quiet but powerful. Pressure loses its effect because your inner blueprint no longer supports influence. Your reactions become measured. Your emotions become clear. Your boundaries become firm. Resilience stops being effort and becomes identity. But you still have not seen the most powerful psychological force that decides whether influence enters or fails. A force so subtle that most people never recognize it until it already controls them. What happens when this force shapes your thinking without revealing its presence? You think your mind resists pressure, yet something inside reacts before awareness. You try to stay calm, but hidden patterns activate faster than intention. If you want unbreakable resilience, then uncover the force that shapes interpretation. The most powerful psychological force controlling resilience is internal narrative. Internal narrative is the voice that defines what something means before you analyze it. This voice is not random. It is shaped by old influence loops, silent expectations, emotional imprints, and subtle conditioning. Internal narrative tells you what to fear, what to trust, what to defend, and what to surrender. You never notice this because the narrative sounds like your natural thought. It is not natural. It is trained. Manipulators understand internal narrative better than most people understand their own thinking. They do not argue with you. They simply trigger the narrative you already carry. Once the narrative activates, your reaction follows automatically. This reaction feels natural, but it is controlled through meaning. Machiavelli once said, "If you direct meaning, you direct action." This describes the entire foundation of internal narrative. Resilience collapses when the narrative bends too easily toward pressure. The first layer of internal narrative is identity scripting. Identity scripting means your mind uses certain beliefs to define who you are. When pressure touches these beliefs, the narrative reacts strongly. Resilience weakens because the mind defends identity more than truth. When identity feels threatened, the narrative creates fear or guilt. Manipulators use this by pushing on identity-based thoughts. Your narrative tries to protect you but ends up obeying influence. The second layer is expectation bias. Expectation bias means your mind predicts outcomes before they happen. These predictions guide your emotional reaction. When predictions are negative, your resilience collapses early. When predictions are unrealistic, your resilience collapses later. Both ways, the narrative controls the outcome. Expectation bias creates mental shortcuts that ignore real evidence. You think you know what will happen, but you are only following old conditioning. You never notice this because expectation feels like intuition. They are not the same. The third layer is emotional scripting. Emotional scripting is the automatic emotional template your mind uses when facing pressure. Each person has patterns their mind repeats. Some feel immediate fear, some feel guilt, some feel frustration, and some feel confusion. Manipulators identify these patterns quickly. They push the same emotional script again and again until the reaction becomes predictable. Resilience becomes weak because the emotional script acts faster than the logical mind. Albert Bandura once said, "If emotion wins first, logic arrives too late." This is why internal narrative often defeats resilience before you notice. The fourth layer is cognitive inertia. Cognitive inertia means the mind prefers old thoughts over new clarity. The mind repeats the familiar narrative because it requires less energy. Inertia keeps you stuck in old interpretations even when they harm you. This inertia is why pressure feels stronger than it should. The narrative repeats because repetition feels safe. You never notice this, but inertia is the reason your reaction barely changes across different situations. Manipulators rely on inertia because it keeps you predictable. The fifth layer is moral self-talk. Moral self-talk is the internal voice that tells you what is right or wrong. Pressure becomes powerful when moral self-talk becomes distorted. Guilt enters easily. Doubt grows quickly. Compassion becomes obedience. You think you are being responsible, but you are only following a narrative shaped through emotional conditioning. Manipulators often target this because moral pressure feels convincing. The narrative uses your values against your clarity. Resilience weakens because moral distortion clouds logic. When these 5 layers combine, the internal narrative becomes the gatekeeper of your resilience. Pressure does not need strength, it only needs access. The narrative provides this access when it operates without awareness. Your reactions follow the narrative, not the real situation. You misread intention, emotion, and meaning. The more distorted the narrative, the easier it is to manipulate your response. This is why resilience feels unstable. The instability comes from the narrative, not the environment. To strengthen resilience, you must restructure internal narrative. Restructuring does not mean rejecting emotion. It means adjusting the meaning behind emotion. Meaning controls reaction. Reaction controls resilience. Every message entering your mind must pass through a filter of intentional meaning. This filter removes distortions and preserves clarity. The narrative becomes trustworthy only when you design it consciously. The first step to restructuring is narrative detection. Narrative detection means observing the moment you assign meaning. You train yourself to notice the first interpretation. That first interpretation reveals the active layer of your narrative. Once detected, you can question it. Questioning breaks automatic influence. The mind pauses and checks reality before obeying emotion. This pause increases resilience. The second step is narrative correction. Narrative correction means replacing distorted meaning with balanced meaning. If your mind calls something threat, ask why. If your mind calls something guilt, ask who benefits. If your mind calls something urgent, ask what evidence exists. You never notice this, but correcting narrative is the fastest way to weaken psychological pressure. Once meaning changes, the emotional reaction loses force. The third step is narrative strengthening. Narrative strengthening means building internal sentences that support clarity and stability. Sentences like "this pressure reflects their intention, not my worth." Sentences like "my emotion is signal, not command." Sentences like "my boundaries decide access, not their behavior." These sentences reshape the narrative until it becomes natural. Resilience grows because the narrative stops helping pressure and starts protecting your mind. Internal narrative also shapes self-perception. Self-perception is how you see your own mental strength. Manipulators weaken resilience by lowering self-perception. When you doubt your strength, you become easier to influence. Pressure rises because doubt blocks clarity. Self-perception must remain stable. Stable self-perception creates a narrative that rejects manipulation. The mind stops absorbing false meaning. Emotional draining becomes harder because your perception supports your strength, not your fear. You also need to understand the silent role of internal comparison. Internal comparison is the mental habit of measuring yourself against imagined standards. These standards come from conditioning, not reality. When comparison grows, your narrative becomes harsh. Harsh narrative weakens resilience. Manipulators use this harshness to raise guilt and doubt. When guilt rises, your boundaries open. Pressure enters without resistance. The narrative becomes your enemy, not your defender. Restructuring comparison requires neutral awareness. Neutral awareness means seeing your internal standards without judgment. Ask why your mind holds certain expectations. Ask where those expectations came from. Most expectations were planted through earlier influence, not personal choice. Once you see the source, you can adjust the expectation. When expectation becomes healthy, the narrative becomes balanced. Resilience becomes stronger because the emotional weight decreases. Internal narrative also controls future orientation. Future orientation is the way your mind projects upcoming events. If the narrative is fear-based, the future becomes threat-based. If the narrative is guilt-based, the future becomes responsibility-based. Influence enters through these projections. Pressure feels stronger because the mind prepares for danger. Resilience fails early because the narrative creates tension before anything happens. Future orientation must be corrected by replacing fear predictions with neutral predictions. Neutrality stabilizes emotion. Stability increases resilience. Another hidden factor inside narrative is memory bias. Memory bias means your mind recalls moments that support your current emotion. If you feel fear, your narrative remembers failure. If you feel guilt, your narrative remembers mistakes. The memory becomes selective. Manipulators target this by triggering emotions that awaken selective memory. You think the memory is truth, but it is only emotional recall. Resilience breaks because memory reinforces the pressure. You protect your mind by questioning the memory. Ask whether the memory reflects the entire truth or just the emotional version. This questioning weakens memory bias. Weakened bias strengthens resilience. Now understand the most dangerous effect of internal narrative. Narrative fusion. Narrative fusion happens when your identity and your reaction merge. You stop saying, "I feel pressure," and start saying, "I am weak." You stop saying, "I feel guilt," and start saying, "I am responsible." This fusion destroys resilience. The mind cannot defend itself when the narrative becomes identity. Manipulators exploit this by pushing reactions that feel personal. Once fused, you lose distance from emotion. Distance is necessary for clarity. Without clarity, resilience collapses. To undo narrative fusion, you must create separation between self and reaction. Remind your mind that reactions are temporary states, not permanent truth. States change, truth remains stable. When you separate state from identity, the narrative softens. Pressure loses its grip. Emotional draining becomes weaker. Resilience rises slowly but consistently. But one more layer still waits beneath the narrative. A layer that silently determines which thoughts survive and which thoughts disappear. A layer that shapes your reality without making noise. What happens when this silent layer decides your perception before you even think? You sense your thoughts forming freely, yet something edits them before awareness. You try to trust your judgment, but unseen filters rewrite your perception. If you want unshakable resilience, then expose the quiet force shaping your reality. The silent layer beneath internal narrative is cognitive filtering. Cognitive filtering decides which information enters your awareness and which information gets erased. This process is invisible. You never feel it working. The mind removes signals that challenge old beliefs and highlights signals that support emotional patterns. You assume you see the whole picture, yet the filter shows only fragments. Manipulators rely on this because the filter determines your perception faster than logic. Cognitive filtering creates a mental tunnel. Inside this tunnel, your thoughts follow predictable direction. Pressure becomes stronger when the tunnel narrows. Clarity disappears because unwanted information cannot enter. The filter shapes your emotional weather. It determines whether tension feels heavy or harmless. You never notice this, but your emotional response often comes from what the filter hides, not from what it reveals. The first part of this filter is selective attention. Selective attention chooses what matters before you consciously decide. When pressure appears, the filter searches for familiar emotional patterns. These patterns guide your focus. You see what matches your fears and ignore what challenges them. Manipulators use this by activating emotional cues. Once the cue triggers the filter, you see exactly what supports the influence. Machiavelli once said, "If you control what people notice, you control what they believe." Selective attention is the perfect example of this truth. The second part is confirmation tendency. Confirmation tendency searches for information that agrees with your current emotion. If you feel doubt, you notice signs of weakness. If you feel guilt, you notice signs of failure. The filter blocks neutral information and amplifies emotional information. The mind begins to believe the emotion more than the evidence. Resilience weakens because internal balance disappears. Emotional weight becomes heavier than reality. The third part is threat bias. Threat bias is the tendency to interpret ambiguous situations as danger. The filter pushes your attention toward risk even when no actual threat exists. Pressure becomes bigger because your filter magnifies danger. Manipulators use threat bias by creating uncertainty. Uncertainty activates survival instincts. Survival instincts narrow awareness. Narrow awareness lowers resilience. You react faster than you think. You obey emotion before you question it. The fourth part is guilt reinforcement. Guilt reinforcement is when the mind highlights anything that triggers responsibility or shame. Guilt becomes a lens over your perception. Every message looks heavier. Every signal feels personal. The filter increases guilt because guilt is easy to manipulate. Guilt makes boundaries soft. Guilt makes decisions unstable. Albert Bandura once said, "If guilt leads your perception, influence enters without resistance." Guilt reinforcement ensures that perception stays weak. The fifth part is motivational distortion. Motivational distortion appears when the mind interprets events in ways that protect old habits. If a habit prefers comfort, the filter calls discomfort unnecessary. If a habit prefers avoidance, the filter calls confrontation unreasonable. The filter hides choices that demand strength. Resilience weakens because awareness becomes selective. The mind assumes certain paths do not exist simply because they require effort. These 5 parts form the silent force controlling your perception. Pressure affects you not because it is powerful, but because the filter chooses information that strengthens pressure. Perception becomes your enemy when the filter serves old conditioning. Resilience breaks because the mind reacts to incomplete information. The hidden manual warns that resilience collapses fastest when the filter narrows without awareness. To strengthen resilience, you must expand the filter. Expansion means widening awareness beyond emotional cues. Expansion begins with disruption. Disruption means interrupting the automatic route of your attention. You question what the filter highlights. You ask what information is missing. The moment you question the filter, the tunnel widens. Pressure weakens because you see more than the influence wants you to see. Expansion also requires mental neutrality. Mental neutrality means observing signals without emotional color. Neutrality is not coldness. Neutrality is clarity. When you observe without emotional coloring, the filter loses its control. Your perception becomes balanced. Manipulators lose leverage because emotional cues no longer dictate attention. Neutrality allows you to hold multiple interpretations. Multiple interpretations decrease pressure. One powerful technique for expanding the filter is counter-narration. Counter-narration means creating alternative explanations before trusting your first interpretation. If the mind says this is danger, you create a neutral possibility. If the mind says this is guilt, you create a balanced possibility. If the mind says this is failure, you create a factual possibility. Counter-narration breaks the filter's dominance. Once multiple meanings exist, the filter cannot force a single emotional path. Another technique is sensory grounding. Sensory grounding means focusing your awareness on observable facts, not assumptions. Facts stabilize perception. Assumptions amplify pressure. Grounding interrupts threat bias and reduces emotional tilt. When perception returns to facts, internal turbulence decreases. Resilience grows because the filter becomes weaker than your clarity. Cognitive filtering also controls emotional memory. Emotional memory appears when the mind remembers moments that support the current filter. Fear awakens fear-based memories. Guilt awakens guilt-based memories. Disappointment awakens failure-based memories. The filter supplies emotional memory to strengthen its direction. Manipulators use this by triggering emotions that recall past weakness. When the memory appears, you believe the pressure more deeply. Resilience drops because the memory feels real. To weaken emotional memory, you must challenge the recall. Ask whether the memory is complete. Ask whether the memory is distorted by emotion. Ask whether the memory reflects current reality. When you challenge memory, the filter loses authority. Emotional memory becomes just memory, not instruction. Resilience rises because the past stops shaping the present. The silent danger of cognitive filtering is cognitive shrinkage. Cognitive shrinkage happens when the filter becomes so narrow that the mind stops considering possibilities. You feel trapped because the filter hides every alternative. Pressure becomes unbearable because the mind sees only one path. This path supports the influence. Shrinkage happens slowly. You never notice it because the filter removes awareness gradually. By the time you feel trapped, the filter has already erased options. To reverse shrinkage, you must deliberately expand mental possibilities. Ask what else could this mean? Ask what other intentions exist. Ask what interpretation supports clarity, not fear. Each question widens the filter. Each widened filter increases resilience. Your mind returns to spacious perception. Pressure loses its control because pressure cannot dominate a mind with wide awareness. A deeper dimension of cognitive filtering is meta-filtering. Meta-filtering is when the filter decides which thoughts survive long enough to influence your behavior. Some thoughts vanish instantly. Some thoughts stay long. The filter chooses based on emotional relevance, not accuracy. Manipulators exploit this by making certain emotions dominant. The filter then keeps thoughts that support that emotion. Your perception becomes an emotional landscape, not a rational evaluation. Resilience collapses because the filter rewards vulnerability. To break meta-filtering, you must practice thought retention. Thought retention means holding a thought long enough to evaluate it. If a balanced thought appears, you hold it. If a factual thought appears, you hold it. If a neutral thought appears, you hold it. The filter loses control because you decide which thought survives. Survival of thought determines survival of resilience. Now understand the most hidden effect of cognitive filtering. The filter does not only shape perception, it shapes identity. When the filter repeats certain interpretations, identity adapts. Identity forms around familiar emotional patterns. If the filter highlights weakness, identity becomes fragile. If the filter highlights guilt, identity becomes self-sacrificing. If the filter highlights failure, identity becomes doubtful. Identity becomes the product of the filter. Manipulators understand this long before you notice it. To rebuild identity, you must rebuild perception. The moment perception becomes balanced, identity becomes stable. Stable identity resists manipulation. Stable identity supports boundaries. Stable identity strengthens resilience. The filter no longer decides who you are, you decide. But this silent force still depends on something deeper beneath it. A mechanism that decides whether the filter strengthens or weakens. A hidden regulator controlling mental energy direction. What happens when this regulator takes control without your awareness? You think your resilience depends on strength, yet something weaker decides your direction. You believe your mind chooses freely, but a deeper regulator selects your focus. If you want complete resistance, then expose the force that controls your mental energy. Beneath cognitive filtering lies the regulator known as attention allocation. Attention allocation silently moves your mental energy towards certain thoughts and away from others. This regulator shapes not only your awareness but also your emotional endurance. Pressure becomes powerful not because it is overwhelming, but because the regulator feeds it attention. Manipulators understand this. They do not attack strength, they attack attention. Once attention bends, everything else follows. Attention allocation is the internal mechanism that decides what stays in your mind. Whatever receives energy grows. Whatever loses energy fades. Resilience weakens when the regulator invests energy into fear, guilt, confusion, or tension. Resilience strengthens when the regulator invests energy into clarity, neutrality, awareness, and boundaries. You never notice this because attention feels like a natural reaction. It is not natural. It is shaped through internal conditioning. The first dimension of attention allocation is emotional magnetism. Emotional magnetism means certain emotions pull attention more strongly than others. Fear pulls harder than curiosity. Guilt pulls harder than neutrality. Frustration pulls harder than logic. Manipulators exploit this by activating high magnetism emotions. Once activated, your attention locks onto the emotional signal. You feel trapped because your mind cannot look away. Machiavelli once said, if you capture attention, you capture choice. Emotional magnetism proves this truth. The second dimension is cognitive urgency. Cognitive urgency is the sense that something requires immediate mental engagement. Urgency does not mean importance. Urgency means manipulation. When the regulator senses urgency, it pushes energy toward the urgent thought. Urgency overrides logic and creates internal pressure. You react quickly but inaccurately. Urgency drains resilience because the mind loses patience. Albert Bandura once said, if urgency guides action, clarity becomes silent. Manipulators rely on this silence. The third dimension is cognitive load. Cognitive load is the amount of mental weight you feel. Heavy load reduces your capacity to evaluate options. The regulator then pushes attention toward the easiest emotional path. This path often supports manipulation because it requires less energy. You think you chose it freely, but you only selected the lowest resistance. Resilience weakens because mental weight exhausts willpower. The fourth dimension is familiarity bias. Familiarity bias directs attention toward old emotional patterns. The regulator prefers familiar emotions even if they harm you. Fear feels familiar. Guilt feels familiar. Doubt feels familiar. The regulator feeds energy into these emotions because familiarity feels safe. Manipulators push familiar triggers because the regulator responds instantly. Resilience weakens because familiar emotions dominate the mind. The fifth dimension is cognitive stickiness. Cognitive stickiness means certain thoughts stay longer than they should. These thoughts grip attention like mental glue. The regulator holds them because they match previous conditioning. Sticky thoughts drain energy. Sticky thoughts distort perspective. Sticky thoughts become emotional anchors that prevent clarity. Manipulators use repetition to create stickiness. Once sticky, the thought becomes a loop. These 5 dimensions form the core of attention allocation. When the regulator reinforces emotional magnetism, urgency, load, familiarity, and stickiness, pressure becomes heavier. Resilience collapses because mental energy becomes unbalanced. Your mind cannot hold clarity because energy flows toward vulnerability. The hidden manual warns that influence enters through energy direction, not emotional strength. To strengthen resilience, you must take control of attention allocation. This begins with energy awareness. Energy awareness means noticing where your attention flows and why. You observe whether your attention moves from emotion or intention. This observation breaks automatic control. Once you stop automatic flow, the regulator weakens. Pressure stops spreading. The next step is energy redirection. Energy redirection means shifting attention from emotional pull to factual analysis. If fear pulls attention, you redirect it to pattern recognition. If guilt pulls attention, you redirect it to boundary evaluation. If doubt pulls attention, you redirect it to neutral questioning. Redirection transforms your thinking. The emotional magnet loses power because redirection breaks the chain. Another powerful method is attention fractioning. Attention fractioning means dividing attention so that emotional intensity reduces. Emotion becomes lighter when attention spreads across multiple signals. Fear loses weight when broken into smaller parts. Guilt loses weight when examined through neutral lens. Manipulators lose control because emotional pressure becomes diluted. Fractioning increases resilience by weakening emotional force. To master attention allocation, you must also build attention endurance. Attention endurance is the ability to hold a chosen focus despite emotional distraction. Endurance grows through consistent practice. You hold focus on clarity even when fear rises. You hold focus on neutrality even when guilt pushes. You hold focus on boundaries even when doubt appears. Endurance creates stability. Stability increases resilience. Another essential technique is attention cleansing. Attention cleansing is the removal of unnecessary internal noise. Noise appears as looping thoughts, repetitive guilt, vague suspicion, or imagined threat. Noise drains energy. Once energy drops, resilience falls. Cleansing means identifying noise and releasing it. The regulator stops feeding noisy thoughts. Clarity returns. You must also understand the silent role of attention absorption. Attention absorption happens when a single emotion takes full control of your focus. You feel absorbed because the regulator invests all energy in one emotional state. This absorption creates emotional blindness. You do not see alternative interpretations. You do not see balanced signals. You only see what the emotion demands. Manipulators use this state because absorbed attention cannot evaluate intention. Resilience collapses because absorption removes choice. To escape absorption, you must create mental distance. Distance means observing emotion without merging with it. Distance returns energy from the emotion back to neutral awareness. Distance breaks the absorption. Manipulators lose power because emotion loses fuel. Another hidden factor is attention fatigue. Attention fatigue happens when your mind becomes tired from managing too many emotional signals. Fatigue weakens decision-making. Fatigue lowers internal discipline. Fatigue makes you surrender quickly. Manipulators create fatigue through emotional repetition. Repeated tension drains energy until resistance fades. To prevent this, you must rotate attention. Rotation means switching your focus intentionally to preserve mental energy. Rotation protects endurance. Endurance protects resilience. Attention allocation also influences how you interpret silence. Silence can feel heavy or neutral depending on energy direction. Manipulators use silence as a psychological trap. Your mind fills silence with fear-based assumptions. These assumptions feel real because the regulator feeds them energy. When you control attention, silence becomes neutral. When silence becomes neutral, resilience becomes stronger. The regulator also decides the emotional intensity of memory. Strong memories return when emotional energy feeds them. Weak memories vanish because they lack energy. Manipulators activate memories that serve their intention. You think the memory rises naturally, but the regulator brought it forward. To weaken this, you must reduce emotional energy feeding old memories. Memories lose influence when energy shifts away. Resilience rises because the past stops controlling the present. Now understand the most dangerous function of the regulator. It decides the duration of attention. Duration shapes reality. If attention stays long on fear, fear becomes truth. If attention stays long on guilt, guilt becomes identity. If attention stays long on doubt, doubt becomes worldview. The regulator decides duration based on emotional intensity, not factual accuracy. This is where influence becomes powerful. To break duration control, you must set intentional time windows for emotion. You allow emotion to exist, but limit its duration by choice. After the window closes, the emotion loses authority. Duration becomes your decision, not the regulator's decision. Resilience strengthens because emotional states remain temporary. But there is still one more hidden system beneath attention allocation. A system that shapes your entire worldview without making a sound. A system that defines what you consider real or unreal. What happens when this deepest system controls your reality before you even notice? You trust your perception, yet something older defines your reality before thought. You believe you see clearly, but hidden structures decide what truth becomes. If you want complete resilience, then reveal the deepest system shaping your mind. Beneath attention allocation lies the final psychological foundation known as cognitive schema. Cognitive schema is the internal map your mind uses to understand everything. This map tells you what events mean, what emotions signal, what intentions imply, and what reactions feel natural. The schema exists before awareness. It shapes how you think before you think. Manipulators never attack your strength. They attack your schema. If the schema bends, your entire reality bends with it. The schema is created through past experiences, old conditioning, repeated influence, and emotional imprints that went unchallenged. Every belief you carry grows inside this map. Every assumption forms inside this map. Every fear and every doubt follow pathways built by this map. When the schema becomes distorted, resilience becomes fragile. Your mind begins to misread reality. You never notice this because the schema hides inside your automatic interpretation. The first layer of cognitive schema is belief coding. Belief coding forms the core truths your mind accepts without question. Some beliefs support strength. Some beliefs support weakness. Manipulators target belief coding by repeating messages that challenge worth clarity or stability. Once a belief becomes coded, it turns permanent unless consciously rewritten. Machiavelli once said, "If you plant belief, you never need repetition." Belief coding proves this. Once the belief changes, the reaction changes automatically. The second layer is emotional mapping. Emotional mapping links certain emotions to certain meanings. Fear becomes proof of danger even when danger does not exist. Guilt becomes proof of fault even when intention was pure. Confusion becomes proof of failure even when the situation is unclear. Emotional mapping makes interpretation feel automatic. Manipulators intensify these emotions to activate the map. Once activated, the mind follows emotional routes even when inaccurate. The third layer is associative linking. Associative linking is the silent connection between signals and conclusions. A tone becomes linked with rejection. A pause becomes linked with threat. A change becomes linked with blame. None of these links are factual. They are created through old conditioning. Once linked, the mind stops evaluating intention and simply reacts. Resilience collapses because the mind reads patterns that do not exist. The fourth layer is identity anchoring. Identity anchoring is when certain beliefs attach to your sense of self. If the schema anchors weakness, identity reflects weakness. If the schema anchors guilt, identity reflects guilt. If the schema anchors doubt, identity reflects doubt. Anchoring is powerful because the mind defends identity before it defends logic. Manipulators change the anchor by activating emotional repetition. Once the anchor shifts, your entire worldview shifts. The fifth layer is predictive scripting. Predictive scripting creates inner expectations about how events will unfold. These expectations shape emotional readiness. Fear-based scripts prepare your mind for danger. Guilt-based scripts prepare your mind for failure. Doubt-based scripts prepare your mind for collapse. Predictive scripts guide attention, focus, and interpretation. They become self-fulfilling. Manipulators use subtle cues to activate these scripts. Once activated, your mind behaves as predicted. These 5 layers create the deepest psychological system, controlling your resilience. Pressure affects you because the schema interprets neutral situations as emotional threats. Resilience collapses because the schema magnifies emotional possibility. The hidden manual warns that no strategy can protect you unless the schema becomes conscious. To strengthen resilience at the deepest level, you must reconstruct the schema. Reconstruction means rewriting the map of meaning. Rewriting begins with schema recognition. Recognition means observing the first meaning your mind attaches to an event. Ask, why did my mind choose this meaning? Ask where this meaning came from. Ask who benefits from this meaning. Recognition exposes the code. The next step is schema interruption. Interruption means breaking the automatic connection between emotional signals and interpretations. When fear rises, you question the meaning. When guilt rises, you question the source. When doubt rises, you question the accuracy. Interruption prevents old roots from activating. Pressure weakens because the schema cannot run automatically. The third step is schema correction. Correction means replacing distorted patterns with balanced patterns. You shift from threat-based beliefs to evidence-based beliefs. You shift from guilt-based interpretations to responsibility-based interpretations. You shift from doubt-based thoughts to neutral thoughts. Correction reshapes the emotional map. Once the map changes, pressure loses its pathway. Another powerful technique is schema expansion. Schema expansion means giving your mind more interpretations than just the emotional one. If something feels negative, you create multiple possibilities. If something feels uncertain, you create multiple outcomes. If something feels personal, you create a neutral version. Expansion weakens associative linking because no single meaning dominates. Manipulators lose power because the schema becomes flexible. Also understand the hidden mechanism known as schema reinforcement. Reinforcement is when the mind strengthens distorted meaning through emotional repetition. Each time fear repeats, the map deepens. Each time guilt repeats, the map deepens. Each time confusion repeats, the map deepens. Reinforcement makes influence permanent. To prevent reinforcement, you reduce emotional repetition. You refuse to relive old emotional imprints. You choose neutrality over intensity. The schema also influences what you consider truth. Truth becomes shaped by emotional consistency, not objective accuracy. If an emotion repeats often, the mind declares it truth. This is one of the strongest tricks inside dark psychology. Manipulators trigger the same emotional pattern repeatedly until you accept it as truth. You protect your mind by questioning emotional truth. Emotional truth is not truth. It is only internal familiarity. Another hidden function of the schema is perception zoning. Perception zoning divides your awareness into safe zones and danger zones. Once something enters the danger zone, the mind reacts defensively. Manipulators push neutral signals into danger zones to create fear. They push mild uncertainty into danger zones to create tension. Resilience weakens because danger zone reactions are fast and emotional. You break this by redrawing the zones. You evaluate what truly belongs in danger and what does not. The deepest threat hidden inside the schema is self-merging. Self-merging happens when your mind fuses identity with conditioned reactions. You stop seeing reactions as conditioned. You start seeing them as self. Once self merges with conditioning, influence becomes effortless. Resilience becomes impossible because you think you are defending your identity while actually defending your conditioning. Albert Bandura once said, "If identity fuses with conditioning, clarity becomes unconscious." Self-merging is the reason many people cannot escape pressure. To break self-merging, you must create identity separation. Identity separation means recognizing that your thoughts are not you, your emotions are not you, your reactions are not you. They are only patterns shaped by earlier influence. Once separation grows, the schema weakens. Pressure loses identity leverage. Resilience rises from within. Understand this final secret. Every external pressure lasts only as long as the internal schema supports it. If the schema removes support, the pressure collapses instantly. Your resilience becomes unstoppable because no influence can shape meaning without your permission. Manipulators rely on the parts of your mind you do not examine. Once you examine them, their power ends. But the hidden manual ends with one final warning. Your mind now knows the systems beneath influence, yet one question remains. If your resilience becomes unbreakable, will you recognize the moment when someone tries to bend it again without you noticing?